Damini came back with the night clinging to him. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality, but the weight he carried followed him inside, heavy, bitter, unresolved. EBA looked up from where she sat, instantly reading the tension etched into his face, the tightness in his jaw, the storm brewing behind his eyes. "You spoke to him," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Damini nodded, loosening his collar as though the air itself had turned hostile. "He has no intention of doing right by Ibani," he said at last. "No cleanup, no safeguards, just profit. He knows exactly what it will cost the rivers, the people. He doesn't care." EBA rose slowly and crossed the room, her presence grounding, familiar. "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice steady even as her eyes searched his. For a moment he said nothing. Then he took her face in his hands, thumbs brushing her cheekbones with reverence. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "Together." Something in his certainty broke through the fear she'd been holding at bay. She leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest, listening to the strong, reassuring rhythm of his heart. His arms came around her, firm and protective, as though he could shield her from the world if he held her tightly enough. The kiss that followed was slow, searching, less urgency than need, a meeting of breath and resolve. Ibimini's lips traced a path along her jaw, lingering, familiar yet newly charged, while EBA's fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself to him. For the moment, all thoughts of pollution, her community, oil spillage cleanup disappeared. Instead, she gave herself up for passion, feeding his desire with all the warmth and passion of her own. In that quiet room, with the future uncertain and danger looming, they found solace in each other's warmth, in shared breaths, in unspoken vows. For tonight, love was enough. And as the river murmured beyond the walls, ancient, watchful, enduring, they held each other, knowing that whatever battles lay ahead, they would not face them alone. Her mind suddenly drifted to when he first arrived, and she smiled. EBA had noticed the shoes first. They were wrong, gleaming, polished Italian leather catching the sun like an insult. No one from Ibani wore shiny shoes to an oil spillage site. You came here in rubber sandals, barefoot, or not at all. Her fingers tightened around the soil she was scooping, crude-stained earth pressed beneath her nails. A stranger. She didn't look up as the man stopped a few feet away, his shadow stretching over the blackened ground. Around them, men worked in tense silence, faces hardened by years of neglect and broken promises. Only one woman knelt among them, head bent, skirts hitched, hands deep in poisoned soil. "I'm looking for EBA," the stranger said. Her hands stilled. "Who needs to know?" she asked coolly, still not lifting her head. There was a pause, just long enough to suggest surprise. "Damini Clayton George. I'm the COO of DEG Industries." That did it. EBA rose abruptly, turning to face him, her eyes blazing. "So you're the face of the poison, the man whose company keeps choking our rivers and then pretending it's an accident." Damini stiffened, taken aback by the fire in her voice. "That's unfair," he said, scoffing lightly. "I've been COO for 5 years. Yes, there have been spillages, but DEG has consistently allocated funds for cleanup." She laughed then, sharp, bitter. "Allocated?" she repeated. "Is that what you call this?" She gestured wildly at the slick water, the dead fish washed ashore, the men scrubbing oil from soil that would never be the same. "Our water is dying, our livelihoods are gone, and you stand there talking about funds?" "This isn't how discussions work," Damini said, irritation creeping into his tone. "You can't just accuse—" "Oh, but I can," EBA cut in fiercely, "because we live with the consequences while your company signs papers in air-conditioned offices. You pollute, you promise, and then you disappear. And now you're here because you want to continue drilling, not because you care." For the first time, Damini truly looked at her, not just as an angry villager, but as a force, mud-streaked, unyielding, fearless. I came to assess the situation, he said more quietly. No, EBA replied, stepping closer, her voice low and resolute. You came to justify it. Around them, the river murmured softly, dark, wounded, listening. And though Damini didn't know it yet, that moment marked the beginning of a reckoning that would change everything he thought he knew about power, about responsibility, and about the woman who dared to stand in his way. EBA turned away from him and clapped her hands sharply, a signal the men understood immediately. That's enough for today, EBA called out in Ibani. Pack up, we go home. One by one, the men straightened, gathered their tools, and began to disperse. Not a single one spared Damini a glance. He might as well have been invisible. Damini watched her, irritation simmering. She didn't acknowledge him, didn't dismiss him, simply erased him. Convenient. Walking away doesn't make your accusations true. She didn't turn. If you're so certain DEG is poisoning this land, then take me to every drilling site you claim is responsible. Let me see it myself. That stopped her. EBA turned slowly, studying him as though he were something newly discovered, and possibly dangerous. Do you truly want to know? She asked, incredulity threading her voice. Damini held her gaze, jaw set. I do. For a long moment, the air between them crackled with challenge and disbelief. Then she nodded once, decision made. Be ready by 6 a.m. tomorrow, she said flatly. She took one look at his shoes and allowed herself a thin, sarcastic smile. And dress appropriately. Those Italian shoes of yours won't do you any good where we're going. Without another word, she walked away, leaving Damini standing alone at the edge of the poisoned river, his certainty already beginning to fracture. The next morning, Damini arrived at the edge of the village precisely at 6. He had traded his tailored slacks for old jeans, a faded t-shirt, and sturdy jungle boots. Practical, unremarkable, deliberately so. He wanted no excuses today, no armor of privilege to hide behind.
Then he saw her. He had seen EBA the day before, of course, but that version of her had been cloaked in shapeless coveralls, her face streaked with oil and resolve, her beauty buried beneath urgency and grime. This morning, she was transformed. Slim-fitted jeans hugged her in a way that made his breath hitch, tracing every generous curve, revealing more than they concealed. A simple top clung to her torso, unadorned yet devastating in its effect. Her hair was pulled back, her face clean, her skin glowing richly in the early light. Attraction hit him, wild, visceral, immediate. She was beautiful, but not in the polished European sense he was accustomed to. This was African beauty in its purest form, full-figured but not heavy, soft where it mattered, strong where it counted. A woman shaped by land and purpose, not by trends. Power lived in her body, in the way she stood, unafraid and unapologetic. Damini swallowed hard. The desire that stirred in him was dangerous, not only because it was sudden, but because it was unwanted. She despised him, distrusted him, saw him as an extension of everything threatening her home. And yet, there he was, painfully aware of her, fighting an urge he knew he had no right to indulge. EBA glanced at him briefly, her gaze flicking over his clothes with a nod of approval before turning away without a word. That dismissal burned far more than her anger ever had. And as he followed her deeper into the village, Damini realized with a jolt of unease that this journey was already changing him in ways he hadn't prepared for. EBA drove him to site after site. She said little, her focus fixed on the narrow, rutted paths as she maneuvered the old truck with practiced ease. Damini watched her hands on the steering wheel, confident, sure, then turned his attention back to the land unfolding before them. What he saw unsettled him. Crude pooled in shallow pits where crops should have been growing, waterways shimmered with an unnatural sheen. Dead vegetation lay brittle and blackened, the earth scarred in quiet accusation. This was not exaggeration. This was neglect, systemic, undeniable. By the third site, Damini was silent. By the fifth, he was humbled. They stopped late in the afternoon at a small roadside food stall, the kind held together by zinc sheets and faith. It was nearly 3. His stomach growled audibly, reminding him he hadn't eaten since breakfast. EBA ordered without consulting him, then sat across from him on a low wooden bench. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I was wrong. About the spillages. About the cleanup. About you." She didn't look at him. "Apologies don't clean rivers," she replied flatly. "I know, but I needed to say it anyway." She nodded once, non-committal. "I want to address the community," he continued carefully. "Let them hear directly from me. Let me answer questions. No handlers, no scripts." That got her attention. She studied him now, searching his face. "And why should they trust you?" "I don't expect them to," he admitted. "Not yet." Silence settled again. Then he realized he was still watching her. "You're staring," she said without heat. He didn't look away. "Because you're stunning," he replied simply, "and I can't seem to stop." Her brows lifted, unimpressed. "Flattery won't save your company." "I'm not trying to save my company," he said softly. "I'm trying to do what's right." She held his gaze for a long moment, then turned as their food arrived, the conversation unfinished, but something fragile and dangerous had shifted between them. They drove back as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the road. The truck rumbled steadily, the air between them no longer sharp but not yet easy. "You didn't have to come today," EBA said at last, eyes fixed on the road. "Most men in your position wouldn't." Domini glanced at her, surprised. "Is that your way of admitting I might not be completely terrible?" She huffed softly. "Don't let it get to your head. I said might." A half smile curved his lips, slow, restrained. "I'll take it." She spared him a brief look, then went back to driving, unimpressed by the expression that usually worked so effortlessly for him. Domini noticed, and something about it amused him. "You know," he said lightly, "most women at least pretend not to notice me." EBA snorted. "I noticed you, I just don't care." That earned him a quiet laugh from him, genuine this time. "So I'm immune?" "Completely," she replied without hesitation. "Your good looks don't clean oil out of water." He studied her then, really studied her, struck by the novelty of being reduced to something ordinary. That might be a first. "Get used to it," she said coolly. "Around here, character lasts longer than charm." As they drove on, Domini found himself oddly grateful for the resistance, for the honesty, for the woman beside him who saw through him and wasn't impressed enough to pretend otherwise. EBA stood at the edge of the gathering, arms folded, expression guarded, yet she found herself listening despite herself. Domini didn't posture, he didn't soften the truth or hide behind corporate language. He spoke plainly, acknowledging the damage, naming his company's failures, apologizing without excuses. He promised change, not vaguely but deliberately, and invited accountability. The villagers murmured, skeptical but attentive. Against her will, something in her shifted. She watched him closely, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his voice steadied when anger arose from the crowd. This was not the man she expected. This was not arrogance or polish. This was courage. Once, then again, his gaze found hers. The look he gave her wasn't triumphant. It was quiet, intent, charged with promise and something far more dangerous, desire. Heat unfurled low in her belly before she could stop it, her breath catching as her body betrayed her careful distance.
She looked away sharply, annoyed at herself. But the truth lingered, undeniable and unsettling. For the first time, she could imagine him not as the enemy's son, but as a man choosing to stand on the right side of history, and far too close to her heart. They walked slowly toward her home, the village settling into evening around them. The road was quiet, dust rising softly beneath their feet. For a while, neither spoke. "You surprised me today," Ibie said at last, breaking the silence. "Your humility, your sincerity. I didn't expect that." Domini shook his head slightly. "I only said what needed to be said." "No," she insisted, stopping and turning to face him. "You didn't deflect. You didn't excuse it away. I was prepared to fight you, and instead you listened." She inhaled, then added quietly, "I was wrong about you." He stopped walking. For a moment, he simply looked at her, his gaze steady, searching. Then his lips curved into something softer than his usual smile. "Wrong enough?" he asked quietly.
To be my girl? Her eyes widened. Damini, she began, we barely know each other. He stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, as if giving her time to pull away. She didn't. I know, he said, but I know this. You're brave, you're principled, you love your people fiercely, you don't bend for power, and you don't flatter men for comfort. He paused, his voice dropping. You make me want to be better. Her breath hitched as he closed the last inch between them, her body responding before her mind could catch up. The heat of him, the certainty in his presence, sent a shiver through her. And you, he murmured, breath warm against her lips, feel like home I didn't know I was looking for. Before she could respond, he cupped her face and kissed her. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't gentle either. It was a kiss that claimed and promised all at once. Deep, sure, intimate. His thumb brushed her jaw, his touch reverent, as though memorizing her. When he pulled back just enough to speak, his forehead rested against hers. I know it's only been days, he murmured, breath warm against her lips, but I know this. You're it for me. Ibie's heart raced, her resolve wavering under the weight of his conviction. The night wrapped around them, the river whispering in the distance as she stood on the edge of something powerful, dangerous, and impossibly real. The days that followed changed everything. Damini insisted on going deeper into the heart of the damage, villages others had written off as statistics. He listened as elders spoke with trembling voices, accepted meals from women who had little to give, and crouched to play with children who climbed him like they'd known him forever. He didn't flinch from their anger or their grief. He stayed, and in staying, he became beloved. Ibie watched it all with a tightening chest. Somewhere between his quiet apologies and his laughter with the children, she realized she was falling, hard and without a safety net. The night before he was to leave, he walked her home again. The air was thick with things unsaid. At her door, she stopped and turned to him. Come in, she said softly. Damini inhaled deeply, then exhaled, his jaw tightening. Ibie. His voice was hoarse now, stripped of his usual steadiness. I'm barely holding on to my self-control. If I step into your house tonight, I won't be able to pretend I don't want you. Her gaze didn't waver. I don't want you controlled. I want you honest. Something broke loose in his eyes. He followed her inside. The door closed behind them, and suddenly they were in each other's arms, breath tangled, hearts pounding, no clear beginning, no memory of who moved first, only need, only certainty. His hands framed her face as though she were something sacred, his forehead resting against hers as if grounding himself. When he kissed her, it was slow, reverent, devastating, a kiss full of everything he'd been holding back. She answered him without hesitation, her fingers clutching his shirt, her body pressing closer as if it had always known where it belonged. They moved together as one, touches exploring, learning, cherishing. The world narrowed to soft murmurs, shared breaths, and when he entered her, it was sacred, the warmth of skin against skin. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't careless, it was deep, intimate, and unspoken promises passed between them in the dark. Later, wrapped in each other's presence, Damini traced idle circles on her back and whispered her name like a vow. Ibie rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, knowing, with a calm that surprised her, that whatever came next, they had crossed a line neither of them would ever want to retreat from. That night didn't just bind their bodies, it bound their futures. Damini left the next day, driven by a promise he made to himself and to the people whose lives had been scarred by the spill. He told Ibie he would be gone only a few days, just long enough to find out why no cleanups had begun, despite all the assurances. She watched him leave with a knot in her chest, reminding herself that this was who he was, a man who couldn't look away once injustice stared him in the face. A few days turned into a week. He called every day, without fail, sometimes twice. His voice was steady, but clipped, as though he was constantly bracing himself for another blow. He asked about her day, about the river, about the women and children he'd bonded with, and every time he ended the call the same way. I love you, Ibie. Don't worry, I'll be back soon. She said the words back, but the unease never left her. She could hear it in the pauses, in the way he exhaled before speaking, as though he was carrying something too heavy to share over the phone. Damini returned 9 days after their night together. When Ibie opened the door, her breath caught. He looked worn down, his usually confident posture dulled by exhaustion, his eyes shadowed with strain. Whatever battles he'd fought, he hadn't emerged unscathed. She didn't question him, she simply held him, letting silence do what words could not. That night, he loved her with an intensity that left her shaken, like a man reclaiming something he feared he might lose. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, his back against the pillows, her head resting against his chest as his heartbeat slowly steadied beneath her ear. It was then he spoke. "I didn't do what my father wanted," he said quietly. Ibie lifted her head, her brows knitting. "What do you mean?" "He wanted to push ahead without cleanups, pretend the damage was minimal. I couldn't be part of that." His jaw tightened. "So I bypassed him."
Her breath hitched. Bypassed? Your father? I went straight to the bigger companies, Damini continued. International ones. I negotiated with them to obtain the drilling rights from DEG Technologies. He let out a tired laugh that held no humor. It means walking away from my family company, from everything my father built. The weight of his words settled heavily between them. You did that? She whispered. Yes, he finally looked at her, his eyes bare and unguarded. If I go through with this, I'm finished there. No protection, no inheritance, no name to hide behind. His voice roughened. But those companies will be forced to clean up first, properly, billions if necessary. It'll be written into the contracts. Ibie pushed herself up, staring at him as though seeing him for the first time. Damini, that's your family, she said softly. Your father. I know. His hand came up to cup her cheek. But I won't build a future on poisoned land or stolen breath. Not yours, not this community's. Emotions surged in her chest. Shock, fear, awe, all tangled together. She had expected compromise, excuses, half measures. She had not expected this. You're sacrificing everything, she murmured. A faint smile touched his lips, weary but resolute. Not everything, he said. I still have you. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she leaned into him, finally understanding the depth of the choice he was making, not just for her people, but for the man he was choosing to become. His father arrived the next day, stepping into a community he hadn't set foot in years. The convoy alone announced him, polished SUVs cutting through familiar roads as though they no longer belonged to the people who lived there. Word spread quickly, and by the time he reached the square, the chiefs were already assembled. Damini stood beside them, Ibie at his side. The older man's gaze swept over the gathering with thinly veiled disdain before settling on his son. His lips curled. So, this is where you've chosen to stand. The greeting rites were barely completed before his restraint snapped. He turned fully to Damini, his voice rising, sharp enough to draw silence from the crowd. Traitor, he spat. You turned against your own blood, against the company that made you. Damini didn't flinch. Then his father's eyes shifted to Ibie. He looked her up and down, a humorless cackle tearing from his throat. Ah, he said, shaking his head. So, this is it. You betrayed your family for a woman. Damini stepped forward immediately, placing himself squarely between them. She has nothing to do with this, he said, his voice firm. Leave her out of it. His father scoffed. Everything has to do with it. No, Damini shot back. This is about you making money off innocent people's lives, and me refusing to be part of it. Murmurs rippled through the chiefs. The older man's expression hardened, calculating now. Fine, he said at last. We will clean up the spills. That should end this nonsense. Damini met his gaze without blinking. No drilling until every spill is cleaned, until families are compensated, and until a new agreement is reached with this community. The square went still. For a long moment, father and son stared at each other, Years of power, expectation, and disappointment colliding in that silence. Finally, his father exhaled sharply, the fight draining from his shoulders. "Very well," he said stiffly. "I agree." Then his voice dropped, cold and final. "But from this moment on, you are no son of mine." A murmur of shock swept through the gathering. "You are disowned. Do not ever set foot in DEG Technologies again. As far as I'm concerned, you no longer exist within my company or my family." Domini held his gaze, pain flickering briefly in his eyes before resolve took its place. He said nothing. Ibie reached for his hand, her grip steady, grounding him as his father turned away and walked back to his waiting convoy, leaving behind a son who had chosen conscience over legacy, and a community that had just witnessed the true cost of doing the right thing. As they walked home, the weight of the day pressed heavily on Domini's shoulders. Halfway down the path, he slowed, then stopped. "I need to be alone for a while," he said quietly. Ibie searched his face, saw the storm there, and nodded. She didn't argue, didn't cling. She simply squeezed his hand once and let him go. Hours later, the night had deepened when she returned. She found him seated in the same spot, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on nothing at all, like a man suspended between loss and resolute. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely breaking the silence. He looked up at her then, tired but clear. "It's not your fault," he said gently. "None of it is." She sat beside him, and slowly he began to talk about how he and his father never truly fit together, how nothing he did was ever enough, how disappointment was always his inheritance, and how his father openly favored his half-brother, the one who mirrored him better, obeyed easier. Domini gave a small, hollow smile. "That relationship," he said softly, "wasn't worth as much as it pretended to be." Ibie didn't respond with words. She simply held him, arms wrapped tight, as though she could anchor him to the present, to something real. He turned to her suddenly, cupping her face in his hands, and kissed her with a fierce, unrestrained intensity. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was claiming, desperate, as though he needed to remind himself that she was real, that she was still there. His mouth moved over hers again and again, deep and urgent, like he was imprinting himself on her, like letting go might undo him. Later, when they lay together, he loved her with the same urgency, again and again, holding her close between moments, his hands lingering, his body speaking the fear he wouldn't voice aloud, the fear of losing the one thing that still felt certain. When at last they were still, breath mingling in the quiet, he brushed a thumb along her cheek. "I've started my own company," he said. "It won't be easy. Things will be tight for a while." His eyes searched hers. "Will you rough it out with me?" Ibie answered immediately, vigorously, her answer wholehearted and without hesitation. Relief softened his features. He shifted, then reached into his pocket, his movements almost shy now. He took her hand, his voice steady, despite everything he had lost that day.
"Marry me," he said. "Build this life with me." Her breath caught. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she nodded again, laughing and crying all at once. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Domini." He pulled her into his arms, holding her like a promise made flesh, two people choosing each other, even when everything else had fallen away. 7 years later, Domini returned to Lagos. The summons had come quietly, carried on the brittle voice of an old family lawyer. His father had suffered a stroke, brought on, they said, by shock, by the news that DEG Technologies, the empire he once ruled with iron certainty, was bleeding under Belema's leadership. Domini had known long before the stroke. For over 3 years he had been buying DEG stock methodically, anonymously, patiently, quiet acquisitions through holding companies and proxies. While Belema mismanaged contracts, alienated partners, and bled the company dry, Domini had been preparing. By the time he walked into the boardroom that morning, he owned enough shares to take control. The room went silent when his name was announced. Thelema shot to his feet first. "What is he doing here?" he snapped, face flushing with rage. "This meeting is confidential." Damini remained calm, buttoning his jacket as he took a seat at the head of the table. "Not anymore." The stepmother followed, her composure cracking. "You were disowned," she hissed. "You have no place here." Damini slid a folder across the table. "I disagree." The company secretary opened it. Murmurs rippled through the room as the figures became clear. Share percentages, voting power, control. Belema's face drained of color. "That's impossible," he said hoarsely. "I've owned DEG for a while now," Damini replied evenly. "You just didn't notice." The fury was explosive. His stepmother slammed her palm on the table, her voice shrill with outrage. "This is a conspiracy. You planned this." "Yes," Damini interrupted calmly. "I did." At the far end of the table, his father sat slumped in a wheelchair, thinner, grayer, reduced to a shadow of the man Damini remembered. His hands trembled slightly on the armrests. His eyes, which once were sharp and unforgiving, were heavy with regret. When their gazes met, his father looked away first. "I trusted you," the old man said weakly, to Belema. Belema turned on him. "You're choosing him? After everything?" Damini stood then. "This isn't personal. It's governance." He looked directly at Belema. "You're removed from the board, effective immediately." Then to his stepmother, whose fury had curdled into disbelief. "So are you." Security was called. Protests echoed down the corridor, bitter and humiliating, until the doors finally closed behind them. Damini turned back to his father. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I'm sorry," the old man whispered at last, tears pooling in his eyes. "I was wrong." Damini's chest tightened, but he nodded. "I forgive you." Relief broke across his father's face as Damini continued. "I'll revive DEG Technologies, proper cleanups, ethical drilling, transparency. We'll rebuild it the right way." That night, at home, Damini told Ibiye everything. She had just tucked their 2 children into bed, their soft laughter still lingering in the hallway. She sat beside him on the couch, one hand resting over her stomach, where the faintest curve hinted at the life growing inside her. Her eyes shone as she listened. "You did it," she whispered. "We did," he corrected, pulling her close. Damini looked at his family, at the woman who had stood by him when he had nothing, at the children who bore his laughter and her strength, and felt a peace deeper than triumph. He was happier than he had ever been. And, as he pressed a kiss to Ibiye's temple, one hand resting protectively over their barely there bump, he made a silent vow to protect them, to choose them with everything he had. If Damini and Ibiye's journey moved you, their courage, sacrifice, and love that chose integrity over comfort, then this story was written for you. Their struggles mirror real choices we all face: family expectations, moral conviction, and the power of standing by the people we love. Please like, share, and follow for more stories that resonate deeply, inspire courage, and celebrate love that endures.